Welcome to the Women and Wealth podcast with Esther Sabo. Esther is a respected leader in the field of personal financial advice with over 25 years of experience. After going through her own significant and challenging life-changing events, she overcame fear and self-doubt to launch her own successful advisory firm. Now Esther is ready to share her practical and personal experiences to help other women clear their hurdles and brave life's transitions. In this way, she inspires women to lead fulfilling and confident lives.
Hello and welcome to Women and Wealth with Esther Sabo from Gates Pass Advisors. Today I'm really excited. I get to sit here and listen and learn with you, the audience, because Esther has a great guest on the show. That is Dr. Jim McCabe, and Jim is the president of the ElderCare Resources. His company specializes in elder care and case management services. Over a period of 30 years, Jim has assisted hundreds of families in the areas of elder care, retirement, and long-term care planning. He also consults extensively with estate planning professionals, attorneys, and financial advisors. Jim holds master's degrees from the University of Hawaii and earned his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. Jim and his wife, Deborah, make their home in Pleasanton, California. Esther, how are you?
I'm doing great, Eric. Thank you. I'm so excited to be talking today with Jim because I've had an influx. It's interesting. When I was probably about 15 years ago, I had a number of clients who were either moving into a retirement community or were considering it. And then that's kind of stopped for about 10 years or so, maybe a little bit less. And now there's like another wave of my clients that I started working with maybe 15, 20 years ago who are now starting to consider or making those decisions. And that's the topic of our podcast today. It's interesting when we talk about elder care resources, none of us, and I look at my clients who may be in their late 60s, early 70s, it just seems like, well, they're not elders. We're not elders in the same way anymore. But we'll be talking about all of this in terms of retirement living options with Jim. So Jim, I'm so glad to have you on.
Thank you, Esther. It's great to be with you.
Well, let's jump in because I think one of the things that is tricky for people is exactly, could you define a retirement community?
I can, and actually there are probably 3 or 4 different models. We know about retirement communities like Sun City and Leisure World, which are that they mirror communities that we live in with neighborhoods and streets and all the shopping that goes with that. Probably the newest and most popular option is a Continuum of Care retirement community, or what we call a CCRC. And these properties are set up so that when I move, I don't have to move again if I don't want to, because the campus provides any number of levels of care from independent living all the way through to skilled nursing and hospice care.
And this is often what clients are thinking of when they're thinking of retirement community, because what we talk about in our meetings is one spouse is either concerned for the other spouse I have a number of these situations right now, as I mentioned, that they don't want to burden their spouse with all the ongoing care that the home will need. And they have already received a diagnosis that they know is going to be over the long term debilitating to them, let alone, they joke, and I'm not really helping with any of the house care stuff now, so it's not going to get any better. So they look at those types of things. And then others who are just saying, how can I not be a burden to my children? But they're complicated, right? The CCRCs.
Well, they are complicated for both good and not so good reasons. The complication on the good reason side is that there are communities that offer such a broad array of services, not only for folks that have failing health, but for people who are still healthy, who are looking for a place to get out from under the responsibilities of maintaining a home and move into a place where a lot of that's taken care of, and also capture a social setting when they can make new friends and develop new relationships.
Yeah, that social component is so important. isn't it? I mean, that's one of the things where people say, I'm staying in my house forever, but it can be lonely.
Well, it can, because families move, adult
Yeah.
children get transferred to jobs in other areas. What's interesting, Esther, when you talk about working with your clients who want to plan, a lot of seniors today who are still very healthy and looking at that plan are looking ahead to, this is the one time to pick that environment that we want to be in, where the day-to-day issues are going to be taken care of, and we're free to take advantage of our retirement time or our leisure time, because there's less maintenance responsibility and many, many more social options for being with other people.
Yeah, and then how I've heard this a number of times in the past 2 years, as well, not 2 years, I guess it just feels like 2 years, maybe the past 15 months since COVID hit, is people go, oh, I'm so glad I'm not there because you're so limited in terms of your interaction.
Well, partly that, but now what you're seeing in a trend with the people that you work with, and this is pretty much countrywide, as we feel like we're getting a handle on COVID, those
Yeah,
people who were thinking about that move 2 or 3 or even 4 years ago
yeah.
are now saying it's time to go kick the tires. And most of the communities have been very proactive about keeping environments safe, and people are ready to go.
Right. And ready to go in terms of investigation.
Yes, and in many parts of the country where the housing market is so good for people who want to sell their home, it's even more incentive for saying, let's start the process of planning this.
Right. So I know you have some great insight into an experience of helping people with this kick the tire process that you mentioned. Could you tell us about that? I know we could talk for 2 hours, but if you can give us a sense of, how do people go kick the tires of one of these communities?
Well, there are usually 3 or 4 parameters that I suggest they consider. The first, of course, is financial, and what kind of investment they can make and are willing to make. Secondly is geography. And if they're currently in an environment where they love the culture and the lifestyle and the families nearby, we're going to consider that it's something that's done locally. And then thirdly, what's on their wish list in terms of amenities? Do they want to be connected to a golf course? There are some CCRCs now developing in partnerships with universities where people want that academic or that cultural connection that comes with a college, that they can take advantage of educational opportunities and sporting events and things that are going on in a campus that's near them.
So, because of course the work that we do in terms of providing financial advice, let's delve a bit more into the financial, because there are the different levels of buy-in, the different ways that money could be returned after one's no longer living in the CCRC. Can you speak to the different financial considerations?
Yeah, and that's a great question that people need to be aware of. A lot of these properties have what are called equity contracts. And so if I found a place that I like and I'd like to get serious about the process, the property will sit down with me and we will vet one another, if you will. I'm gonna look at what the property has to offer, maybe what kind of business model it uses, and they're going to be looking at my ability to afford this financially in the long term. And they're also going to be looking at what some long-term healthcare issues might be. Once we've done that, most models look like this. I give them a small amount of money to reserve a space, and when that comes up, then I write a fairly sizable check, and we can talk about amounts in a minute. And then that buys me into this contract for life care. And then there's always a monthly payment that covers some of the other things like house cleaning and meals and expense that I might have if I'm having a relative come and stay with me for a while. Now, some of those equity contracts look like this. I can get, depending on how long I'm there and the front end investment, I may elect to get 10% back or 20% or sometimes more. All of the business models are a little bit different. But that money comes back to me in one of two ways. If I buy in and move and within a certain period of time decide this really isn't for me, I can close the contract and depending on how long it's been, get a certain amount of that money back. The other version of this is that I'm there for life, and once I pass away, there is a certain amount of equity that's been maintained that's given to a beneficiary that I've designated at the beginning of the agreement.
And then those amounts that are designated for the beneficiary, from what I've seen, they don't appreciate. I know that there's different ways, so we'll talk about that, how the beneficiary receives the funds. But my understanding is they don't appreciate from the time that they're paid. So that the beneficiary is quote unquote guaranteed X amount of appreciation per year. So they're just receiving, if it's $1 million to go in 2021 and the parents pass away in 2035, they're going to get $1 million back. They're not going to get $1 million plus any appreciation. Is that right?
Well, the short answer to that is yes, that usually the amount is specified. However, the second answer is that each contract that I've seen in my work is different from the next one. And as these contracts evolve, that's one of the things that we're going to do in our diligence when we do the initial review is what does the equity contract look like? Is there a way that that money grows or does it stay at a fixed number based on what the original agreement was?
And then there's also those requirements where the buy-in means they actually buy the unit and the property has the ability to buy it back or it's upon the beneficiaries to sell. Is that correct also as an option?
Those are rare. Some of the models are set up so that I basically purchase the building and the ability to live there, but the folks who actually own the land will have discretion over how the sale of that property takes place once I pass away.
Right.
So it's a little bit like that model where it's leasehold, if you will, that
Yes.
I've purchased into this, but there's another party at work here who has a financial interest in the disposition of those resources when I pass away.
So it does require that there's a good review of the contract so people are really clear. When do you recommend that people obtain a contract and how do they go about accessing it?
Well, that can the kind of the general parameters of that contract should be available to me once I contact the property, talk to usually the marketing person and say, I'm getting serious about this. I'd like to know what the business model is for your property and what the contract involves. And a good majority of the places are very transparent about this because they recognize it's a significant investment and it's good business practice not to have there be any surprises once I've gotten into the process.
Backing out a little bit more, what do you recommend when people consider visiting a property?
Well, on the emotional side, I always suggest that folks do it when it still seems like fun. And that would be that you call and say, I'd like to come over and have lunch and get a tour and talk to some of the residents. Or if you know someone who's there already, get them to bring you over for part of a day and buy you lunch and get a real firsthand look at what it is. The plus of that is that I'm doing it at a point when there's no pressure financially or there's no time frame for getting the decision made in 30 or 60 or 180 days. And so now it's more focused on a lifestyle kind of review than it is on the demand for getting logistics done in a certain way.
So this is, we talk a lot on this podcast about how financial decisions, they're often made emotionally, but justified logically. So this is a very emotional as well as absolutely a logical decision. And I always wonder if people go once, does that give them enough information? Going back to your kick the tires, if they go once and if they review the contract and we run the numbers. Is that enough on which they can make a decision, do you think?
Typically, no. Once it starts to become a possibility, and we're not at the reality stage yet, but once it becomes a possibility, we start thinking about practical things like the just logistics of my things and how my time will be defined once I get there, if it's going to replace the time that I have in my hobbies and activities now. I think the third thing is that process of going from probably maybe to yes, we're going to do this requires probably more than any other stage that I'm really paying attention to the details. And I'll give you two examples. And the biggest one is, does this property take pets? And I've worked with a lot of families over the years who found the place, it fit with all of the things that they wanted and needed, and then they discovered that they couldn't take their four-legged friends with them. So it was a real game changer and a huge disappointment. Other things include your opportunity to have overnight guests or hosting social events at the property or bringing the grandkids to hang out for a day and use the pool or the gym or whatever else is there.
So those are really good points in terms of community and what is that like and what is my experience. And let's talk a bit more as the issues are. I mean, we all hope that we have the fun part and very little bit of the ill health part. But what about those who, let's say there's two partners that move in and one needs more care than the other. Can you talk a little bit about how the continuous care lays out?
Yeah, that's a great question, because now we've looked at this property as a long-term investment and commitment. Most of the CCRCs, the Continuum of Care Retirement Communities, have 4 or 5 levels of care. And so it looks something like this in the majority. There is an independent option, which could be an apartment or a standalone house, condominium. Then there's an assisted living resource, which is available as my health fails, or more commonly, I get the flu or I break a hip and I go to the hospital and go to rehab and come back to my CCRC. Now I may need to be in assisted living for a couple days or couple weeks to get that rehab finished. So that can be either permanent move to assisted or temporary. Then there's skilled care. Then there's memory care, and then there's hospice care. So we've now signed into an environment that will allow me to go from what I call elderly, staying active and all of that, to those real important services for skilled care and maybe preparing for the final stages of my life. So it's a nice comprehensive model that's developed. One of the things I do tell my clients is make sure that if the campus is telling you we have these 4 or 5 levels of care, that they are offered on that site. And I bring that up because I worked with a couple, this has been many years ago, that bought into independent and assisted and skilled care, but the skilled care was done in a building, another facility that was 6 or 8 blocks away. So it made it harder for the healthy spouse to see the not so healthy spouse regularly.
And that's so important, because that's why I appreciate going through these different things, and I've actually had clients have great satisfaction in the communities. They if anything, they've said, "Oh, I could have done this sooner and I would have been okay." So I'm not, my experience has not been one of disappointment, but I think there is, in our minds, it's such a big decision. It's a life decision. We may be in our late 70s, perhaps early 80s, perhaps when we're really seriously looking at this, and all of us, it's tough to consider all of these choices. And what a challenge to find out that your sweetheart, you have to go see them and you have to go 6 or 8 blocks. And what does that mean? And it's so important to look at these things The brochures all look fabulous. The people are wonderful, but we have to have these conversations.
Yes. And as you know, some families are really good at this. It's time to sit down and chat about a plan.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many families who aren't so good at planning that it's kind of an educational process that we take on so that they make the most educated decisions possible.
How do you account for the family and their input?
Well, usually when I get a call, people have started thinking seriously about this. Or when you and I chat, you have someone that's considering this as a part of their plan. So they started thinking about the it. Sometimes the resistance comes from the children who don't want to see mom and dad leave this home that they grew up in, or
Exactly.
surrender access to a wonderful neighborhood that has amenities or is near the ocean or hiking trails. And so oftentimes it's bringing the younger generations along to a lifestyle change that their parents or grandparents want to make that's been thought about in a very positive way.
So when you say bring them along, do you mean bring them along to visit the site or bring them along through the decision-making process, or tell me more?
Both. That's exactly right. Both. And because it's true that when all of us have some visual sense of what that place is, it changes things dramatically. I'm working with a couple now who had that. We should have done this a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
And here they are in an environment with a pool and a gym and hiking trails, and the kids and the grandkids have really stepped up their wish to come and visit more often because grandma and grandpa are living in a place that's fun. And more importantly, they're really happy with the decision they made about that move.
That's so good, because that's, again, it's all community and social makes such a difference in terms of people's overall well-being. That sounds wonderful. A couple other more practical, going back to the practical and technical, when we're talking about these buy-ins and we're talking about the monthly fees, there is a part to address in terms of the possible tax deductibility of these items. Is that correct?
Yes. Esther, you're so good at remembering what the financial side of this is in terms of asking questions. The properties are required to provide a written statement each year for their residents that tells them what the profile is about expenses that have been made that they should consider letting their tax people know might be available as write-offs. And those formulas are beyond my expertise because I'm not an accountant, but the paperwork that I've seen that my clients have been presented with is very good, very complete, and has all the data that you need to supply it to your tax person or for doing your own taxes.
Yeah, and I found, I mean, that's a critical piece of information that I often clients are not assuming that that's an issue to even think about because it's not talked about in the marketing discussion. And in some cases, it does not apply. This is not 100% across the board. But when we're looking at things like selling a home, the capital gains tax, planning for this, planning for how much, what does cash flow look like, it can make a very big difference if there is a deductible amount on the buy-in and the monthly in terms of what's projected to be left in a client's pocket after paying these fees. So it's a really important piece to get clear on. Again, it's not 100%, right, Jim? It's not all retirement communities.
Well, correct. And for the population that we're talking about, Esther, who may be moving in and have little or no medical issues. So there's a very minimal expense to what they're doing to manage their health care.
And then the other is continuing on this theme of the healthcare. This is a question we get asked often because as I've talked about on the podcast, and I'm sorry for my insurance brethren, but I hate insurance, but I have insurance. It's something that we have to pay a lot for that we hope we never have to use. And with long-term care insurance, I am a proponent of long-term care insurance. It has to be planned. It's not a black and white, like everyone has the same program. And for some cases, people can self-insure. So it's not, again, an across the board. But I often get asked, well, when I move in, I don't need my long-term care insurance anymore. Is that correct? And how do you respond to that, Jim?
Well, what I tell them is this is another example of what you're asking the question of the property of what am I paying for?
Mm-hmm.
So I've had clients that have been in both camps, more who've been in the camp where the money that's collected up front and then in the monthly payment goes to pay a policy in part that is owned by the property. So what they're doing is collecting money that go toward a premium, if you will, to fund my long-term care once I move into those higher levels. But this is one of the questions that people need to ask, which is that has to do with the insurability profile that comes once I sign a contract. And the second piece of it is the equally important question I suggest people pose, which is to say to the person, what's not paid for in the buy-in fee and the monthly fee that I would give you if we get under contract? Because there are always going to be some things that are going to end up needing to be paid out of pocket. We just don't know from property to property what those are.
And I love asking what's not included because it makes it very clear. So then if we ask what's included, that's wonderful, but it's an invisible question, what's not included, until it's asked. So I really appreciate just that question. I think is very, very useful. And I've had situations when people do move in and their neurological capabilities have reduced so much that they're not a fit anymore for the property. And maintaining their long-term care insurance helped them get into a situation that the long-term care insurance then covered completely. And if they had let it go, it would have created a very different outcome. We love these decisions, and hopefully they are quote unquote final decisions, but everything changes, doesn't it, Jim? I mean, it's not like, okay, we're done. We don't ever have to worry about that again. Things happen, don't they?
They do. And the point that you just made underscores the request that if you have a long-term care insurance policy, call your agent, tell them what you're thinking about, or in most general terms, ask them how what I have now as a policy fits with the potential move into a CCRC.
Well, it's good that clients have people like you and me who love looking at all of these things to help support them along the way. So as we wind up today, Jim, it's been fabulous talking with you as always. Do you have any resources that you point people to help them start getting their toe in the water of this a bit more?
Yes, I do. Actually, there are a couple things that I could then I'm more than willing to share these with you, Esther, for you to provide, or people can contact me. I have a retirement housing checklist. It has 20 questions on it, and it just gives people a chance to start to get a sense of what that puzzle's going to look like. And I hope minimizes some of the surprises that can come up if we forgot to ask all of the relevant questions up front.
I think that's great because it's a one-page document. I can be contacted for that at esther@gatespassadvisors.com or through the website, contact us. And Jim, if someone needed to reach you, how would they reach you?
They can reach me through my email, which is jmeldercare@yahoo.com. And my phone number, Esther, is 480-231-5984. And you asked about books. I could make a couple suggestions. These books have been around for quite a while, but they're good, solid, basic written pieces about considering the move. One is a book that was written by a gentleman named Bruce Risley, Wrisley, and it's called The Seniors Housing Dilemma, Stay or Move. And again, if you don't have a pen, email me and I'm happy to send that information. And Esther, I'll provide it to you so that you have it as well. The second book is written by a gentleman named Ace McCloud, and I really like that name. It's called Senior Living, Senior Housing, Senior Retirement, the Best Places for Seniors to Retire. It has a really nice overview, not only of places to consider, but questions to ask when I'm going through that decision process.
Jim, thank you so much. You've given, just love your practical suggestions and your experience. And so really invite people to contact me or contact Jim if you're thinking about these types of questions to help you work them through so that you have really a strong feeling of confidence in your financial future. So thank you again, Jim.
My pleasure, Esther. Thank you.
This is fantastic. I love the fact that you brought up so many practical things to think about, things I would not have thought about. I'd hate to go through the process, find a place that I fell in love with, and then find out, oh, you're not going to let me bring my dog. That one little nugget right there was like, oh man, there's a lot to consider. So thank you so much for all that information. Esther, any closing thoughts from you today?
The only thing I can think of for today is knowing the size of dogs that you tend to have.
True.
For those who don't know, Eric tends to have Great Dane mixes and Mastiffs and all these gigantic creatures. So that would be quite a shock if you moved in with one of those. So I agree.
Yeah.
It's good to find out as much as possible ahead.
Well, when I do have mobility issues later in life, I want to be able to ride my dog to the store or whatever. So we'll see how that goes. Again, Jim, thank you so much for being on the show. Esther, of course, thank you for bringing him on the show. And our last thank you goes to you, the listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Women in Wealth podcast with Esther Sabo. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Esther comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your friends and family. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at Gates Pass Advisors, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Women and Wealth podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you receive notifications of new podcasts as they become available. Check out the website at www.gatespassadvisors.com for more information. This content is developed from sources believed to be providing accurate information. The information in this material is not intended as tax or legal advice. Please consult legal or tax professionals for specific information regarding your individual situation. The opinions expressed and material provided are for general information and should not be considered a solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security.